Welcome to the Ascend podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Chris Hopper.
And I'm Dan Harrison.
Each week we delve deep with some of the brightest and most forward-thinking, out-of-the-box minds in health, consciousness, mindset, and spirituality.
This show inspires our listeners to improve their body and mind, and our intention is to fuse and unlock the conscious warrior and shift the balance in the current paradigm.
DMT stimulates the imagination. DMT helps, regulate, consensus reality, as it were. So it also, may be, more specifically that, DMT is mediating our perception of the visual world as well. Think about, DMT as an endomatrix. It's the, naturally occurring, matrix, which gives appearance, gives, form, to the world as we normally perceive it. I'm not sure if it's, say, going beyond the self as perhaps, more of an expansion of the self. Plants are also, perceiving, but it's occurring at a different level or in a different, way than we're, normally used to, thinking about such things. What is the soul? And, what is its relationship to consciousness? And, to the living body and to the dead body. Does a rock have a soul, for example? Or does a plant have a soul? So it, could be that, DMT is this ultimate, technology.
Hey, what's up everyone? Living in the information age, it's easy to develop a false sense of how much we really know when all the answers to all our questions are just a few clicks on Google. But with all this information at our fingertips that can be accessed at any time, is it possible that it has become harder to accept not known? In this podcast with Dr. Rick Strassman, we discuss his thoughts on consciousness, the universe, and ultimately how DMT can serve as a powerful reminder that we know nothing at all. Rick Strassman is most known for the DMT studies that were featured in the amazing documentary DMT, the Spirit Molecule, that is available for free on YouTube. And I've also put the documentary in the show notes at the Ascend podcast website as well. DMT is such an interesting and complex technology, and the reason I'm calling it technology is because I really think sometimes we define technology by a laptop, a mobile phone, or even listen to this podcast. But maybe if some form of intelligence was trying to communicate with us, it wouldn't necessarily have to be in the form of a radio. Maybe it could be another technology in the form of DMT. If you're not familiar with DMT, it is so fascinating. It exists in some form in every plant and animal, including our own human vessel. But due to our own inner chemistry, we usually don't access it. But if you expose yourself to DMT, many people talk about how it sends you down a wormhole into another large reality, into another dimension, another world, whatever you want to call it. Rick is certainly a big pioneer in the research of DMT and knows a lot about it. However, if I was probably to say to him he knows a lot, he would probably say he doesn't really know anything about it. But before we jump with this podcast, also please don't forget to leave a review of the podcast and just let us know what you think. So anyway guys, without further ado, and this is a great episode, Dr. Rick Strassman. Well, Rick, I'd just like to say welcome onto the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, definitely. We're both huge admirers of your so important research, and a point I wanted to bring up to start this as well, Rick, and I've thought about as well, I think that we're living in a time where information is so accessible and it's everywhere as well, and it's so easy for us to develop this false sense of how much we really know. And maybe this is due to the fact that we're now getting to a point in time where, in our human evolution as well, where we believe all the answers to our questions are just a few clicks on Google. But with all this information at our fingertips that can be accessed at any time, I was thinking maybe it's possible that it has become harder to accept not known.
Well, I think there's as much misinformation about really fundamental issues out there as there is, sort of a true understanding of what the issues are. Yeah, and I think it relates to what you're referring to. It's just so easy to get information, but sometimes it's hard to determine its quality.
I think as well, like Rick, DMT, it serves as this like powerful reminder that we know nothing at all, and maybe that is one of the reasons like DMT does exist, because it's needed to give us this powerful reminder that we do know nothing. But apart from that, Rick, like the billion-dollar question is, why do you think it exists?
Well, I think it exists because it possesses the properties that it does. It has certain effects. And it's, the right molecule for the right function. It would depend on your worldview in, some ways, but, starting with the fact that DMT has certain effects on consciousness, makes you think that is the reason it exists. So what are those effects on consciousness?
Yeah.
And one can sort of place that in an evolutionary context, a psychological context, a spiritual context. And within the spiritual context, I mean, you could even subdivide that into the Eastern or the Western, spiritual models, the inwardness of spiritual information, or the external nature of those spiritual realms. What I've been thinking the last few years is that DMT stimulates the imagination, and by imagination, I'm not referring to things made up, but things which we are able to perceive, sensory, emotional, physical kinds of phenomena, as opposed, to the intellect, which, deals with abstract ideas, abstract things. So what seems to occur with DMT is that it stimulates the the vocabulary of the imagination, or the phenomenology of the imagination. So it isn't as if that, without a well-developed intellect to understand what those contents of the imagination contain, the information contained in those imaginative contents, then it's just a trip. It's interesting, it's visual, it's emotional, it's even inspiring, but one, I think, needs to also develop, the ability to interpret what you're seeing in a state of heightened imaginative activity. So I think to some extent, that helps explain the varying degrees of impact that a psychedelic experience has on people.
Yeah, definitely, Rick. It's like, for me, it's like the planet needed a way of communicating with us in a strange way, and it placed DMT in all plants and all humans and all animals. Right.
It definitely seems to be a conduit of communication. It seems to be a means by which things that we're normally not aware of enter into our minds.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, Rick, the connection of DMT and in the connection with all species as well on the planet is so fascinating. And I know that your research has uncovered that potentially that every living organism in the world has DMT in it potentially. And if that is the case, this new age idea of being fully connected holds true, that we are connected by this one simple molecule, and it could be this common molecular language that we really could communicate or even create with as well.
Well, I think that's a possibility. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes like to refer to DMT as a spiritual Esperanto, kind of a common language that is which is shared by all organisms which contain DMT. I'm not sure if every living creature contains DMT, but so far it's been discovered to exist in every mammal. that's been examined, and hundreds, if not thousands, of plants. But it could be that some organisms contain it and some don't. But it's still an open area of investigation.
Yeah, definitely. I was wondering as well, all the studies that you've done on DMT, were they all carried out in a lab environment?
Yeah. The results, the stories, the narratives, the case reports that I describe in my DMT book were all carried out, during the performance of their research study at the University of New Mexico back in the 1990s.
Yeah. I was just because, Rick, I was just wondering if there was a difference between nature versus a laboratory environment.
Well, even though the first-hand or close to first-hand reports that I emphasize in my DMT book come from the laboratory study, I'm getting emails all the time from people who describe their DMT and ayahuasca experiences to me, and I don't think that the laboratory environment influence to a great degree the nature of people's experiences. Sometimes sometimes people point out to me that perhaps the description of being in a laboratory or a highly technological environment that my volunteers reported was a function of their being in the hospital. But if you read accounts about ayahuasca experiences which occur in the jungle, there are encounters with aliens, with highly over technological societies and species, creatures, flying saucers, laboratories, things like that. So I think one of the interesting things about DMT is because it works so quickly, that it's more of a pure pharmacological effect. With the longer acting psychedelic substances, you have more time to interact with the experience. Your expectations, I think, play more of a role in what you're perceiving. But I think with DMT, the fact that you're there in one or two heartbeats, makes it very hard to kind of modify the contents of the experience. I think you just bring your own personality, your own brain, your own expectations into the session, to only a certain degree. Otherwise, I think it's just the pure activation of wherever in the brain DMT is working, and then you're thrust into wherever DMT seems to lead you.
Yeah, and I like that breakdown there, Rick. I liked how you said that. But Rick, have you looked at the functionality of DMT inside of say plants versus animals?
Well, with respect, to the botanical, presence or properties of DMT, I haven't really looked into that very much. Dennis McKenna is, kind of the world's expert on, botanical DMT and related compounds. But, primarily, I, ran my study in humans, and I'm a lot more, current on, the animal literature.
Rick, I was wondering as well, I think I heard you mention before as well, in another statement that you made, was talking about that the human function of the brain requires DMT for normal functioning. And you were talking about how maybe DMT is actually mediating our perception of the natural world. Is that true?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a possibility which is raised by the fact that DMT is actively transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier using energy. And there's only a very small number of compounds that the brain treats that way. Things which are critical for its function, which it's not able to make on its own. Things like glucose, for energy, specific amino acids for protein synthesis, which the brain isn't able to make on its own. So DMT is one of those compounds that the brain expends energy to get into its confines. So that would make you, wonder, well, why does the brain need DMT? And, the most obvious answer is that, DMT helps, regulate, consensus reality, as it were, as a result of existing within the brain, within a narrow, window of concentration. One of the expressions I like to use about DMT within that context is that it may function as a kind of reality thermostat. That concentrations, if they get too high in the brain, become strange, and if concentrations become too low, they become maybe flat and dull. So it may be the case that the brain requires the maintenance of a certain narrow window of DMT levels. What's also interesting is more recently a group in Wisconsin has discovered high levels of the enzyme and the gene activation responsible for that enzyme making DMT in the primate retina, the eye. So it also may be more specifically that DMT is mediating our perception of the visual world as well.
Well, I was just gonna say, it's kind of like when DMT strips away the brain's filter on reality, really, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure if it strips it away as much as maybe generating it. It may be generating our view of reality, or at least mediating it somehow. Well, the movies Matrix, where everything is a computer-generated reality. You could even think about DMT as an endomatrix. It's the naturally occurring matrix, which gives appearance, gives form, to the world as we normally perceive it. Which makes you wonder what would happen if you could do a knockout species or knockout organisms which no longer make DMT. Like for example, if you could engineer a rodent to have no more DMT, you could blockade the gene responsible for the enzyme that makes DMT. What would the consciousness of that animal be experiencing? It starts to get a little strange when you think about DMT as generating our perception of the world. Because it makes you wonder why that's the case, and it also makes you wonder if our current if our current consensus reality is a DMT mediated hallucination. What does that have to say about about cause and effect and free will and our sense of solidity, morality, interactions with people and the environment. So it opens up a whole can of epistemological worms, as it were.
Yeah, it kind of affects nearly everything, really, doesn't it? The whole DMT, it really looks into all aspects of reality and beyond, and that's why I think it's so interesting that it kind of does change the way our perception views of what we are looking at through ourselves, and it does rip this filter mechanism way, and it seems to allow us to go beyond the self.
Well, I think it allows us to go beyond our normal understanding of the self. It certainly provides the access to tap into things which we don't normally perceive. I'm not sure if it is if it's going beyond the self as perhaps more of an expansion of the self.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, with that expansion of the self as well, I think something that came to my mind there, Rick, was like activating the senses. And I think we know about the senses that's been documented, and I really think there's like certain other things that we can do or take, like to activate other senses, and maybe DMT is one of them.
It stimulates, the imagination, and the imagination is the repository of sensory data, and especially visual. So, and I think that the presence of the gene in the retina that makes DMT, points to the importance of DMT and the sensory mechanisms of humans and other animals. It's interesting. You were asking about the presence of DMT in plants, and we usually don't think about plants as perceiving, especially with sense organs. So even if DMT in plants provides a means of communication, it kind of makes you wonder if perhaps plants are also perceiving, but it's occurring at a different level or in a different way than we're normally used to thinking about such things.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how you said that, because I think there's intelligence in plants that we don't fully understand. We really don't. But I think as well, something I want to touch on with you, Rick, as well, is like DMT and the connection to unlocking DNA. And I actually heard Dennis McKenna talking about how like DMT's existence may be a message. And he talks about like if some intelligence was trying to communicate with us, it wouldn't be necessarily in the form of radio. And I think he said it. He talks about building a message in DNA. But something in the correlation of that which fascinates me a lot, and a lot of psychedelic reports, not all of them, but in quite a few cases, many people mention like an interaction with like serpents. And I know as well, I've looked back as well in many ancient texts, there's always records of these like serpents and stuff like that. But however, a theory I have, maybe the serpent like is in the past and now as well, it's just like a metaphor for DNA. So maybe maybe DMT can unlock or tap into something like a message within our DNA. Like, have you ever thought about that?
Are you familiar with Jeremy Narby's work, The Cosmic Serpent?
No, I'm not.
Oh, you must read his book. It was written in the 90s. Jeremy is an anthropologist. He's a Canadian, lives in Switzerland now, anthropologist, got his doctorate at Stanford. And he spent a lot of time in the Amazon, drinking ayahuasca. And he, believes that DMT allows us to visualize our DNA through a photoelectric, piezoelectric, photoelectric. Photons are somehow critical to his theory. So that's a theory that Jeremy developed maybe 20-25 years ago now, and I think it's got some merit. DMT will do what's called, it will do this thing called intercalation within the DNA. It will kind of place itself within the double strands of the DNA, almost like a nucleotide. So it is able to deform or to change the conformity of the DNA double helix. So it could be that is one of the ways in which DMT and consciousness and DNA seem to be related to each other. But Jeremy develops the photoelectric photochemical theories to a much greater extent than I can summarize.
That's really interesting, because I think as well, maybe when I was thinking about this, Rick, maybe when people do try and extract all the information, like in correlation to DNA as well, and from DMT, they maybe can't, because I've thought about this, like maybe the verbal, like the verbal communication
is like a difficult one, because I really feel language has its barriers, but maybe DMT is some form of other communication that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the case. I still don't think we've got an adequate, language that helps describe what people perceive on DMT. Other psychedelics as well, but I think especially in the case of DMT, we just don't have that vocabulary. So the message of the DMT experience, the information content contained in it, can be kind of elusive, and I think that's one of the reasons that people have turned to Latin American shamanism or to the Eastern religious models as a way of describing the information content. One of my old close friends is a mathematician from UC Santa Cruz named Ralph Abraham, who's taken a lot of DMT. And as a result, he concluded that the universe is made up of vibrations. And as a result of his DMT experiences, he developed the field of visual mathematics, which he's developed to model the vibratory state of the universe that he discovered on DMT. And so I've talked with him about the notion that people don't seem to be able to return with much verbal information from the DMT state, and he believes that that could be because DMT is exposing a world of mathematics as opposed to a verbal world, which is a very interesting idea.
Wow, it certainly is an interesting idea, and it kind of makes you think as well, like, is information endless really? And it makes you also think, is DMT endless as well? And I think that's a fascinating concept to really fathom.
The experience itself seems to go on and on and on. So you wonder if the information that's possible to obtain from that state is infinite as well. One of the problems with DMT, especially smoked or snorted, or if it's injected, is it's quite brief, and it requires a fair amount of energy, just to be able to orient in that state. And by the time you are oriented and can start interacting with what's there, you start coming down. A couple of months ago, a colleague of mine from Japan and I, published a paper describing a model for extending and prolonging the DMT experience. It's not been done yet, but we kind of lay out the pharmacology of establishing that kind of a state, and theoretically, it's now possible to put somebody in the DMT state and to keep them there for a very long time, for hours even, and you could adjust the concentrations, go up or down depending on how the person's doing, what they're interested in accomplishing. So it could be with the application of that model, we'll be able to start characterizing that state more precisely, but also I think we'll be able to start extracting some more information from that state, especially in the interactions with what people commonly describe as beings who seem to be quite intelligent, contain information, but it's hard to establish consistent and stable communication with them. So it maybe with prolonging the DMT state, that communication will become easier to manage, and could yield some quite interesting information.
Certainly, it really is very interesting. And so, like when Dan mentioned DNA before, Rick, it made me actually think of like everyone talks about like this visual technology, but maybe like DNA is like the ultimate hidden technology, and we've yet to really uncover it. And it's like in the spirit molecule, you speculate that like the pineal gland could very well be a prime producer for DMT within the human organism. And I know since the more recent studies like have been carried out and detected like DMT production within the pineal of rodents. So like a lot of people like talk about the pineal gland like it's thought to play a role in regulating sleep cycles as well, which is like very interesting. So the correlation with like DMT playing a role in dreams is really fascinating, and it's like so. Rick, is there any proof that DMT is one of the reasons like we dream at night, or if it's like still currently speculation at this moment?
Still speculative. Concentrations of DMT in the bloodstream and urine, spinal fluid, whatnot, are extremely low, in the range of a trillionth of gram per milliliter of fluid. And we still don't really have the technology to determine circadian rhythms of naturally occurring DMT, if concentrations of DMT increase or decrease in non-drug states which resemble on by giving DMT, like dreams or near death or things like that. But to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by giving DMT, you have to think that there's some similar biological process going on. It may turn out that we have to look at the expression of the gene in order to determine the activity of the DMT system. It may be easier to do that than to develop the technology to measure levels of DMT itself. Looking at the activity of the genes as opposed to the gene product, as it were, may turn out to be more fruitful. One other thing also that's interesting is to keep in mind the fact that the lungs are the primary source of mammalian DMT. And people seem to live normal lives without a pineal gland. So even though it was determined that the living rodent pineal gland contains DMT, that may not be the everyday 24/7 source of mammalian DMT. That seems to be from the lungs, and that's been known for maybe 60 years by now.
Yeah, it is so fascinating, that thought process, that there may be this connection between like DMT and dreams, and that, like you said before, there does need to be more research done on it, and I think that more things will come to light when we do some more, like when more research is allowed to be done on it. But I know as well, you speculated about this in your book a bit as well, and you speculated about in the documentary as well that the body produces like DMT when we're in like extreme amount of stress. And that's like the kind of stress that we experience like during near death. So if that's true, like what is the purpose of like DMT in death? Like, is it part of the body's process and like sending the soul or a life form somewhere else? Maybe it is.
Could be. And it's interesting, there is some increasing research looking at the relationship between the dying process and levels of DMT. There's a group in Hungary right now which has determined that the brain will live longer in a state of low or no levels of oxygen if there are increased levels of DMT around. In other words, DMT is neuroprotective in conditions of anoxia, or low oxygen in the blood and in the brain. So it could be that one of the things which occurs in the state as you're dying, the anoxic state, when the brain's not getting enough oxygen, is that DMT is released or increases in order to protect the brain from conditions of low oxygen. But still, that begs the question: well, why are the subjective effects of DMT so radical? even if it is, neuroprotective. Why couldn't, such a, neuroprotective agent just be, calming or, just, put you into a, dark, warm state, as opposed to a completely florid psychedelic one. So it, could be that the, two, things that the two, findings are related. That, number one, DMT is, helpful, to the dying brain, but it's also released as a function or in order to, kind of, provide the, transition of, consciousness, from the body, to outside of the body. It could be like the, like the tugboat or the ferry or the bridge or the angel or, some kind of intermediary of, consciousness between it residing in the body and residing outside of the body.
Yeah, definitely. Rick, it's interesting how, like, DMT, like the hormone that's activated, it may be possible that actually facilitates, like, the entering and the existing of the soul as well, and I think the correlation between that is interesting.
I mean, it also, or it, in an important way, that, is, kind of dependent on your definition of the soul. Like, is, the soul, the life force, or is it one's, personality? Or is it one's consciousness, the awareness of what's going on the inside and the outside? So I think it's good to, consider, kind of, what is the soul and, what is its relationship to consciousness and, to the living body and to the dead body. Does a rock have a soul, for example? Or does a plant have a soul? I think when we're discussing, DMT and the soul, it is, tempting to, to consider relationships between the soul and the body and DMT. Perhaps, the soul is an energetic, process which, somehow utilizes DMT. Or is mediated through the activity of DMT in such a way that we're conscious of the soul's movement, and this could occur in everyday life too, in states of inspiration or even just everyday experience. One feels the movement of the soul in the body introspectively, subjectively. Sometimes we're, more inspired, sometimes we're less inspired. And, that could, and I think, that is a reflection of the movement of the soul. But it's a different kind of, soul in humans, I think, than might occur in lower animals or in plants or in, inanimate, kinds of objects.
Wow, that's an interesting thing to think about that, how the soul could vary differently in animals compared to humans. That's so interesting, that.
Yeah, I know. It makes you wonder, like, how they're different, like, what levels are these, like, reaching on?
I know, it's so fascinating to put your mind into that perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, that's, one of the reasons I've been so intrigued, by the Jewish medieval philosophers, is, they were like these mad geniuses who were, physicians and, scientists at the same time that they were, master, theologians and, metaphysicians. So they could, kind of speak at the same time about the different kinds of, souls and animals and plants and rocks or trees, from the point of view of Aristotle. And, could also, look at, the contribution, to their thinking of, the religious, scriptures and texts that they were also extremely familiar with.
And just like keeping on to this like correlation, like in connection to ancient times, in like there's like well looking through like the DMT phenomena like through a scientific lens. Do you think there's also this value of glancing into our past as well, like to learn more about this molecule, like we've been talking as well, like mystic traditions seem to emphasize like the importance of like the pineal gland in these altered states of consciousness, and psychedelic vessels like containing DMT or similar compounds. Do you think there's like the importance like woven into these patterns?
Yeah, I think the relationship of these states of consciousness, to the anatomical location of the pineal gland is, it's just too consistent to be a coincidence, so to speak. The ancient esoteric, physiological, spiritual systems, located the spot or the experience of the highest possible spiritual state, in the same location as the pineal gland. It's it is directly below the fontanelle on top of the head, which is the old location of the pineal gland in lower animals, and like an inch or two down is the location of the human pineal. And we were talking about the lungs usually producing DMT and the pineal sometimes. So it may be that at certain times of extreme spiritual exaltation that the pineal gland kicks in to make DMT, but that still remains speculative. It's interesting. I have heard from a handful of people over the years who have had their pineal glands removed or destroyed. Sometimes you can develop cancer of the pineal and it's destroyed. You can develop an overgrowth of the pineal, like a cyst, and it has to be removed. Sometimes you can have a stroke, which could destroy the pineal gland, and these people seem to all extent and purposes completely normal, and in a couple of cases their spiritual lives seem to increase after their pineal glands were destroyed or were removed. So I think from the medical biological point of view, we still don't really know enough to confirm or refute the old theories of the spiritual significance of the pineal.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting, Rick, how like all these ancient cultures, they were so fascinated by like the effects what the pineal gland could bring to the human civilization, and that there was this big importance, in my opinion, as well, if you look back in history. And I think like through history as well, the use of DMT stretches all the way back through history, and it's always been. I've seen something where it was assumed that for thousands of years, like indigenous tribes and cultures have always been using like DMT in rituals and even cultural ceremonies as well. And I remember Graham Hancock as well. He talks about, he believes that the burning bush of Moses was actually that was a process of smoking DMT.
That could be, yeah. That so that theory came from from a psychologist in Israel named Ben Shanon, who published it maybe 10, 11 years ago or so. Yeah, and the acacia is presumed and by some people to be the burning bush, and if that were the case, then Moses would have been inhaling levels of DMT vapor from a burning acacia plant. But that bespeaks the whole or prophetic experience in the Bible. Is it a result of some plant or some drug or some mushroom or some fungus which is responsible for the DMT like for the DMT like reports of prophetic experience. But if you think about the body is able to make DMT on its own, then you can dispense with having to look for some outside source.
Yeah.
And then you would turn your focus to what could possibly increase the production of one's own DMT in those situations.
Yeah, I liked how you said that, because if you do think back, all these civilizations, like maybe they didn't always need to access it from the tree. They could just basically access it within themselves, and I liked how you said that. And I mean, my thinking as well, maybe DMT and all these other like natural hallucinogens like have aided in our human evolution in the past, and they've been left here for our human evolution?
Yeah, I think, to the extent that, DMT increases our imaginative capabilities, then we're open to being able to perceive things that we aren't, normally able to. And, those could be important and helpful. They could also be, destructive and dangerous. So I think that's, where the development of one's intellectual and ethical and, moral, muscles, comes into play, to be able to extract that information, but also to apply it in the optimal way.
Definitely. And like Rick, I think like right now we're seeing so much like evidence that maybe DMT has played a role in our human evolution, and I think that's exactly from what you've been saying. Like DMT is creating these like ideas through the imagination, and I think that's incredible. And it's like this compound that has great potential in these domains of scientific understanding. But something I wanted to touch on, like Rick, was the spiritual exploration, and like how much do you think DMT plays in the side of spiritual exploration? Like, because it does seem to me that many people are experiencing this intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, clearly people describe the awareness of an intelligence in the DMT space, the state of consciousness, which is, brought about by, high levels of DMT in the body or in the brain. Yeah, but I think I think that the jury is still out regarding what is the exact, nature of that information, and, what is it good for. Like in shamanism, Latin American, shamanism, where they drink ayahuasca, which contains, DMT. The kind of use to which they put that information it's oftentimes bad. Spiritual, warfare, black magic, killing each other, cursing each other, making each other sick. So I don't think that necessarily that information is automatically, useful or, helpful. I think it can be turned one way or the other depending on the person who's undergoing those states and what their motivations are. I think of the DMT state as kind of like, nuclear energy. It can be used to kill cancer cells. It could be used to, power a generator that, keeps, people alive and lights on and computers going. Or it can, level a huge metropolitan city. So I think it all depends on, set and setting, as it were. What's your intention? What are you experiencing these things for? What kind of person are you? What are your motivations? What's your training? How do you plan to use what you've obtained in that state, either for your good, or the society's good, or the planet's good, or for their harm, to abuse people or to abuse the planet. Well, Ernst Jünger, was a German who fought in World War I, and was a close friend of Albert Hofmann. And Ernst Jünger, wrote a book called, I think, Blood and Guns, or Blood and Steel, or Steel and Guns, or some extremely kind of macho, militaristic scree, which was which was loved by the Nazis. The Nazis loved Ernst Jünger and his work and his teachings and whatnot. And Albert Hofmann was very close, friends with Jünger. They would take LSD together. So I think it's important, to not, gild the lily, as it were, with these states that are brought on by these drugs. They can be applied for good. They can be applied for ill. They could just be of, entertainment value. I think the important thing is, what you do with these states and why.
Yeah, it is interesting when you do actually think about what the DMT world is. And I know that Terence McKenna, he described it as he said a bursting through a membrane, and he talked about how it was like a welcome of love. And he's talked about when many people do he was talking about when many people explain the breaking through, whether it's like to another reality or world or dimension or whatever you want to call it. But I was wondering, like, where do you think that like bursting through is to? Like, what do you think is actually the nature of like the DMT world? I know it's quite speculation, but what do you feel it is?
Well, I mean, I think, currently it is, limited, to our, subjective reality.
Yeah.
I mean, even though it is a, subjective experience, that wouldn't, disqualify it from being, common and real. I mean, everybody dreams, but, nobody has ever dreamed somebody else's dream or, taken a, picture of your dream or, those kinds of things, but everybody knows that everybody dreams. And those, dreams just occur in our minds, subjectively. That's the way we know we dream. So the DMT state occurs in our minds. It's kind of located, or our, perception of it is located there. So, whether or, not it resides there, or it's, it is, located there, or is, located outside of us, and we're just, perceiving it in our minds. Yeah, I mean, that's the, $64,000 question. Like, if, is that state, or is, the thing, well, are the things, that we're seeing, purely generated by the mind, or are they just, perceived by the mind in a way that they weren't able to be perceived before? Like a telescope or a microscope allows us to, see things in our mind which are normally invisible. Radio telescopes, all, kinds of, technology. So it, could be that, DMT is this ultimate, technology to, provide access to external things which are, normally invisible. Like, germs are normally invisible. Stars, black holes are normally invisible, and we, have developed, machines and, technologies which allow us to, to perceive, those things. And it, could be that, DMT has, got, that kind of a, biological, technological interface, kind of properties. In the future, could be if these worlds exist external, to us, and for example, reside in dark matter, dark energy. We might be able to, to develop, cameras which are able to, to capture images of the, contents of those, parallel or external, ongoing, freestanding, levels of reality. And once we take, pictures of them, we could, compare those images to what people report on DMT. But until that time, I think the important thing is to, carefully, chart, the territory, which would only result from, being able to spend more, time in that state. Ultimately, I think it's a spectrum of, external, versus internal. Well, it could be at, one extreme of that spectrum, one pole of that spectrum it's, purely a, subjective, personality, brain, generated experience. And on the other hand, is completely external, to us. But it's, I don't think, at the, practical, level that one can, speak in, terms of those kinds of extremes. It's always a, combination thereof. So depending on your personality, on your health, on your state of mind, on your training, you may want to think about what we're perceiving on, DMT as, more external than internal. Like you have a clean window or a clean lens. And in, the case of an individual who's burdened by bad health, bad psychology, bad history, It could be that what one experiences on DMT is more of a reflection, like a mirror, or even a clouded lens, or a clouded window. So that kind of bespeaks the importance of self-development in order to get the most out of anybody's experiences on DMT, to be able to differentiate what's you and what's not you, to the extent that you can anyway.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating, that, Rick. And I think when you hit the nail on the head there, when you said it kind of just gives you what you're seeking, but it's kind of not what you're expecting. And I think that's fascinating. So it's what you need at that moment, and the DMT experience is just giving you that, what you need in that moment, in that area of your life at that time. And I think that's incredible. And I think a lot of people might come out of the experience unaware of what they've done, but it's really impacted them in such a unique way. And that's where we go into so much depth on beyond the self, because we weren't expecting it, and it's something completely different than what we were expecting.
Yeah, some people have terrible DMT experiences. They're horrifying, they're frightening, they're terrifying, they're painful. Yeah, and that kind of that gets to the point that you were making, which is that if somebody isn't ready for a big DMT experience, they get the they get the message saying you have got a lot of homework to do. You have to really work on yourself. You need to understand what happened to you just now. So in the future, if you ever decide to try again, you'll be better prepared.
That's beautiful. I think as well, Rick, this the DMT experience, it kind of raises some very challenging and baffling questions in regards to the current paradigm revolving around the nature of human perception and consciousness. Do you think this molecule has the potential to transform the way science views our place in the universe and how we perceive it?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's one of the reasons people don't talk more about DMT in the mainstream. Terence used to joke about the incredible, function, the incredible effects of DMT. Number one, and number two, it exists within all of us, within all of our bodies, and number three, if you increase levels by smoking or injecting it within a heartbeat or two, you're in this absolutely parallel universe, which is attained quite reliably, consistent, happens every time just about. Yeah, and Terence would kind of bemoan the fact that it wasn't a headline on the New York Times front page once a week saying, we have DMT in our bodies and look what it does. I think it just would. It really raises a lot of questions about how we know what we know, what we know or what we think we know about the nature of consensus reality. What we normally walk around in and interact with. How we consider ourselves. So I think we need to look really carefully at, what is the DMT state, number one, and also to start to figure out, what, turns on the system and what, turns off the system. How is the, regulation of, DMT maintained? Where are the genes? We understand where the genes are, but what turns those genes on? What turns those genes off? Is DMT involved in the dream state? Is it involved in our perception of everyday reality? And if so, to what extent and why? And what is perhaps kind of buttressing or underlying the DMT state, if our perception of consensus reality is a result of a steady level of window of DMT concentrations in our brains. Yeah, I think that the questions that the existence and the properties of DMT rays are just they're endless, and I think they're revolutionary in a way because they would make us question a number of fundamental assumptions that we have.
Yeah, definitely as well. I think them questions as well are the more questions that we need to be digging into as well. And before as well, Rick, when you said it raises a question, I think it raises a question within the societal structure because if you think about it, so DMT is currently like a Schedule 1 drug. However, we know like you said before, we know that DMT is manufactured within our bodies, and obviously. And the compound has this beneficial potential in the domains of like scientific understanding as well as the spiritual exploration which we've been talking about through this podcast. So, and it's curious why like a natural brain hormone like DMT is like still Schedule 1 drug, yet like we said before, we're talking about the ancients like Egyptians pegged it as like the tree of life. And I was thinking like, shouldn't we have like sovereignty over our unconsciousness in a way?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated issues, the scheduling of these drugs. Yeah, and the government is currently is responsible and charged of determining what drugs are legal and what drugs aren't. Yeah, and it is the case that our bodies make DMT, but the concentrations are extremely low. So when you're looking at an abusable or dangerous substance, if you drink too much water, it can kill you. If you are exposed to concentrations of oxygen which are too high, they'll blind you. So DMT in everyday consciousness, as the concentrations in our bloodstream, our body, our spinal fluid, are extremely low. So the issue of scheduling our bodies is a little bit of a hyperbolic approach, because it's all about concentration or dose, as it were. And people can abuse drugs. There's no question about it. And some drugs are more abusable than others. For example, DMT is more abusable than water. So I think there's still needs to be a discussion about the scheduling of these drugs, which will allow their use in a non-abusable setting. And the Egyptians may have used DMT. The tribes in the Amazon are using DMT and ayahuasca. There's DMT being used in Western civilization for spiritual purposes, but I think that all because these drugs can be used in a beneficial way, doesn't take anything away from the fact that they can be abused and cause great harm at the same time. So I think it's important to create a context for the safe and the optimal use of these drugs, but at the same time maintain some responsibility and some liability and some some regulation over their use. I don't think for example that that LSD ought to be as freely available as cannabis in recreational cannabis settings. LSD is a lot more powerful, can cause more problems. But I think if somebody wants to take LSD or DMT in a spiritual setting, in a scientific setting, to do research, to enhance creativity, for all manner of other reasons, or beneficial reasons, or at least potentially beneficial reasons, it ought to be easier than the current scheduling structure
definitely
provides for.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
So there's going to be I think, if a new schedule were created, somewhere between, 1 and 2, as it were, 1A, let's say, where they're still controlled, but there would be, places other than the, research, setting where, people could, safely and responsibly, take and administer these, substances, for various purposes.
Yeah, I agree as well, and I think as well because what we're talking about the confines of what society brings, like the current structure, is I think it's because I think that the social structure that's currently in play are sort of saying that the material world is the only world, and in a way I think that's why it's in place, because they want to try and steer us away from this natural world. And I remember when I think Terence McKenna was talking about, he said a 10-minute hit of DMT was worth 20 years of academic studies. So probably that's another reason as well. But I know as well your work on the subject of DMT is probably one of the most detailed DMT research in existence, in my opinion. But I was wondering what was some of the key conclusions you made about the nature of DMT, sort of in the correspondence to human consciousness over all your research.
Well, are you asking about the long-term effects of being exposed to a big dose of DMT?
Yeah, just in general, Rick?
Well, I think that it establishes the existence of another, level of reality, which can be entered into reliably, consistently, through the administration of a high dose of this substance.
Yeah.
So that's important. That's important information. And what were the people ask me what I learned from my DMT study. What did I described the volunteers' experiences. And I think, one of the conclusions that I came to at the end of my first DMT book is that overall, that the benefit wasn't really all that outstanding, especially with the risks that were potential as well. But I think I was premature in those conclusions, because I just think it took longer, than the amount of time that I, followed up with people, for the long-term effects to make themselves known or to manifest, because because the DMT world is so disjoint from our everyday world that it takes a lot of time to incorporate it, to integrate it. So I think one of the main conclusions that I completed my study is that there is another, world out there, and you take DMT and you can describe it. I mean, it's described in a consistent manner. It exists. But, what the importance of that world existing, what it's good for wasn't that clear to me. And I think it was because it wasn't that clear to the volunteers either, other than it existed. And it like I was saying, it required more time for them to incorporate it, integrate it, manifest it in their lives. So, volunteers, as, time went on, they, some of them changed fields. A number of them developed a spiritual practice that they hadn't been involved with before. Or they, deepen their involvement with that practice. They describe being less afraid of death, more open to the creative process of letting go, those kinds of things, which, weren't all that clear to me as, the research, wound down. I suppose, my, take-home lessons were, number one, there is a spiritual level of reality. Number two, there is a God, which it took me quite a while to come to, and in the context of doing my research, the third thing I concluded was that I was in way over my head. It was just a little too much for me at the time with the toolkit I had at my disposal.
I think as well, Rick, when you said that, I think maybe I was thinking maybe when humans, when we do evolve to that next stage, maybe we'll be allowed to access that next stage of intelligence. Maybe that's the case. We'll have to wait till that till that comes around.
Yeah, I think, we're just at the very, very beginning of this process. Well, one of my, favorite science fiction authors is a Brit named Olaf Stapleton. And he wrote a book called First and Last Men about 19 species of humans. And, the last, dozen are a result of, genetic engineering imposed by humans on other humans. And, a new species, develops. And, if you, read his descriptions of the mental, world of the 19th species of humans, it's, pretty, far out. It's, quite abstract, like, world, telepathy occurs. Like every other, like every human is able to, share in the subjective reality of every other human on the planet. And, there's all, kinds of things which are, created as a result of every individual human, joining, subjective spiritual, forces at the same time in unison. In his, worldview, it requires, 35,000 years, to live, long enough to be able to attain that state. So, yeah, when you start to look at the, ramifications of what the, DMT world, seems to be offering us a glimpse of, the implications are pretty staggering.
And I think that you hit the nail right in the head again there, like Rick, because I think what we've been talking about through this is that this process is so powerful and so special that not everyone is ready for it, and I think that's so unique in what you've been seeing. And I think, like Dan's right, like when the human evolves to like a level where they can understand this and it becomes a bit more common in the practice of people, then it'll be a different story. But I think right now, Rick, on this time frame where we're at right now, is that DMT is out there for people who are really searching for it. And I think when people search for it and they find it, they're going to find their true selves, because they're going to find the answer that they've been seeking through a practice which is called out to them, instead of it just being like a regulated, just run-of-your-mill drug that people could see in the markets. Whereas I think that would be where people are, I don't think, ready for that yet. And I think what we're all seeing here is that the process of DMT is so beautiful that when we do seek it, it's so special to us because we found it. And I think that's beautiful, what we're all talking about right here.
It's a complicated thing. I mean, obviously, I think of DMT more as a tool, than anything else. And like any tool, you need to know how to use it. And hopefully you'll be using it for the good rather than for the bad. I hear from people, their friends, family every so often about people who clearly should never have used DMT, and they just go in way overboard, and they basically develop a very hard to treat chronic psychosis, or they end up in jail, or they end up in a mental hospital. So yeah, I mean, I don't encourage anyone to take DMT, and hopefully I've not been giving that impression. But still, most people don't follow my advice, and if they're going to use DMT, they ought to be they should be prepared, know what they're getting into, educate themselves, do as much of the, groundwork as they can beforehand if, they're going to use it. And then, work on integrating and, sharing, what they, perceive under the influence.
So Rick, from all the DMT research you've done and upon all these conclusions, how do you envision the future of DMT research?
Well, there's a number of different models. The whole question of how we know what we know, the whole question of what is called epistemology is raised obviously philosophically by the existence of DMT and its effects and the fact the brain seems to require it, the eyes seem to be making it as well. So there are philosophical issues which can be addressed and investigated regarding the DMT phenomena. There's clinical research. You can help people with carefully carefully administered DMT. Ayahuasca seems to be quite helpful for a number of medical psychological conditions like addiction and depression, fear of death. So there are treatment implications of DMT in particular, but psychedelics in general. There's what I would call clinical spirituality research, which gives these drugs to enhance one's spiritual practice. So that is a valid use and ought to be pursued. Characterizing the DMT effect as carefully as possible is key. And I think with the continuous infusion model that Andrew Gallimore and I published a few months back, we'll be able to kind of explore in more detail what is the exact nature of the DMT world. For example, what happens if you pick up a rock in the DMT world and you hit it with a hammer? That just isn't known. And if you have more time in the DMT state, you'll be able to perform those kind of experiments. More and more people will come back with those kinds of data. There's cosmological questions like some of our volunteers describe the Big Bang, as it were, and the condensation of energy into matter, matter into galaxies, gas clouds, those kinds of things, slowing down enough into consciousness. So I think smart physicists, cosmologists ought to be able to to have access to a big DMT state to allow their imaginations to range or roam more freely over their topic of interest to see if they could either confirm or refute some of their mathematical models at the level of experience. So there's there's a world of work to be done.
Yeah, definitely. Rick, I just wanted to ask you, how do you envision the role of DMT within, the mechanics of, a future culture that has, embraced it? What kind of, role could it, potentially play in the areas of, science, technology, and even, spiritual exploration in the future?
Along the lines of what we were just talking about, scientific models could be built, based on the DMT experience. Spiritual, practice could be enhanced, theoretically. That's currently mostly taking place within the confines of the Latin American shamanic model and the Eastern religious model. The kind of non-dual, Advaita ego loss, model. But, that isn't anything like what happens with DMT. With a big, dose of DMT, there's no ego loss. You're completely in yourself, and you're interacting with this, independent, world that you're relating to. So I think a more interactional, relational, model of spirituality can also be, fortified or investigated or be supercharged, turbocharged as a result of the DMT experience as well.
Well, Rick, that's a fantastic insight on what the future may hold for DMT. And the last thing we've just got to ask you is where can people find you, and what are you currently working on?
Well, if people want to reach me, they can do so through my website, rickstrassman.com. they can order books through my site. I answer all emails, or 99.9% of emails. And what am I working on? Well, 3 things, I guess. I'm working, well, I guess, 4 things. One is I am keeping my, fingers in the, psychedelic research pie. I, help other groups with their studies, consult, co-author, papers sometimes. I'm working on a translation and commentary of the Old Testament because it's, kind of been what I find most interesting as a spiritual, model for the spiritual effects of the psychedelic drugs. And there just aren't any user-friendly translations and commentaries on the text. It's usually from a, perspective of one's, denomination or their axe to grind. So I'm, working on a, psychologically, psychedelicized, version of, the, translation of the text. I'm working on some autobiographical stuff. I think I've had an interesting, life, and I've been, taking notes on it since I was, 17 years old. So I'm starting to put all those, notes into some, some coherent form. And I'm really interested in the character of Abraham as described in the Bible. He lived a, fully prophetic life. But it was, before the law was laid down at Mount Sinai. So, his, life was a, prophetic life. And, it was, infused and, directed through his, experience of, the prophetic state, which, shares quite a few, features with the DMT state. So in a way, I'm fascinated by him as a, figure from the past who, whose life, manifested, as completely in tune with, the insights that he obtained in a state very, similar to the DMT state. So I suppose, it would be a, form of, biblical, biblical fiction, but, from the perspective of, a spiritual / psychedelic worldview.
Yeah, Rick, when you said there about the psychedelic translation of the Hebrew Bible, that would be so fascinating, and we'll have to definitely, when you delve a bit more further into that would be so fascinating, even in the future, to get you back on and discover what your findings were so far. That would be so cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And share with our audience what.
Well, yeah, it's going to be a lifetime project. I mean, I've been working on this for maybe 6 months or so in a concerted manner. I just finished chapter 1 of Genesis.
We've got a way to go.
It's So I mean, I'd be happy to describe the work in progress, but it's going to probably be only halfway done by the time I die, but still, it's a worthy effort.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I'd just like to say thank you so much for all your work in the the DMT research, Rick, and we do really appreciate your time. And I think the world needs so much more people like you who's willing to put everything on the edge and try and push a positive movement and try and seek out real knowledge in the world. And I'd just like to say thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed the interview. I think we covered a lot of very interesting and important stuff.
Thanks for taking time out your day to listen to the podcast. The concept around Rick Strassman's work in DMT is such a fascinating one, but please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review of the podcast. And also don't forget to head over our website and check out the show notes. Anyway guys, have a great day, and we'll see you next week where we have another cool guest. Peace.